So there's a couple of recent things we've done. We co-sponsored a donut economics webinar with the Community Social Planning Council, One Planet Saanich and South Island Prosperity Project. And I'm just going to stick with that one for a minute. And I've been working with a group of design professionals, one of whom is, or two of whom are in fact Todd and Jasmindra. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago talking about something like a school or an alliance or some combination or both of around the notion of one planet urban design. And all of that is very vague but there's a bunch of very interesting folks, about a dozen, started to have a discussion, local design professionals and developers, about the need for this sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting and very relevant to both last month's presentation and this month's. We have a proposal that we're still, it's a bit on hold at the moment, but the idea of seeds project to identify the seeds of a one planet region. And this is our website, which I think many of you will be familiar with. You'll recognize it's an older screenshot since it talks about the April session. And this is what we're working to do, to expand the conversation, to deepen it, and to connect it to others. And I'm beginning to think, or we're beginning to think, about the idea of a regional alliance for a one planet region. We'll talk more about that in the fall as we think about it over the summer. And these are some of the ways we're doing that. I'm just going to go back there for a minute, because one of the things that we're starting to talk about is that we might be able to start holding these sessions in person in the fall. But if we do, what we want to do is to have not just one session downtown in the library, but sessions around the region so you don't have to come in from Machosen, or you don't have to come in from Sydney, or wherever you happen to be. We'll try and get some more local groups together who can watch the session like this, but then have a local in-person discussion. So watch the session, the opening hour together, and then have a breakout discussion locally. Anyway, if we do that, we're going to be needing volunteers to do that. We're also looking at the idea of kitchen table conversations, again, something we can do more easily in the fall if we can actually get together. And then one of the things we might do and would like to do, and we're talking again to the development group and the design professionals group, is the idea of the One Planet neighborhood co-design charrettes. So a lot of ideas bouncing around. We need both time and energy and some capacity and resources to make those happen. This is one of our key partners, and you'll find some of our older videos on here and other resources, but they have a lot of solutions on here. And obviously, if you haven't already done so, but if you're here, you must have done so, but you can write to me at any time. And as I say, doing all this takes time and energy and financial support. We did have a very successful fundraising, but if you'd like to be involved in anything, contact me again. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the PowerPoints from past presentations are available on Creative United's website, and I actually need to update that with the more recent ones. And then we have our own YouTube channel. So this season, our theme has been the seeds of a one planet region. And we've been looking at and using these principles to look at different topics. And so last month rather, we did something that's not explicitly here actually, which is urban design and development. But this month we are going to be doing travel and transport, although we're not actually using the word transport for reasons that will become clear. So today the topic in fact is getting around in a one planet region, or getting about in a one planet region. And as in the past, once you've heard the presentations, I'll come back to Todd's new book in a minute. Once you've heard the presentations, your discussion in local groups we'd like you to talk about how do you apply these ideas locally, and how do we take these ideas forward to our own and other municipalities. So in order to do that, we have two speakers. We have Todd Litman, who will perhaps be familiar to many of you. He has been the founder and energy and brains behind Victoria Transport Policy Institute, and more recently, a new group he set up or organization called Cities for Everyone. And Jasmindra Drawanda, who is on our board and is an urban cultural and inclusion planner. I hope that's okay, the way I framed that for you, Jasmindra. It's very hard to encapsulate all that she does into 2 or 3 short words. And the theme is going to be getting around in a One Planet region with both of the speakers, and particularly Jasmindra, talking about issues of access and issues of equity that are wrapped up in that. This is Todd's new book, and so one of the new ways of talking about this is to talk about mobility. It's not necessarily transport, because walking is another way of being mobile. But Todd will talk more about that. This is the schedule. So we'll start with Todd, about 15 minutes, and then Jasmindra, and then break out as we have in the past after some general discussion. And Gertie actually isn't with us tonight. She had another date, but thank you to Claire for, in the background, organizing the breakout groups when we get there. Some of the reminders of small group discussion guidelines. And with that, I will come out of that and back to our session here. Nice to see you all. And I'm going to turn it over straight away to Todd. I'm not going to do a long introduction. It's all in the blurb that we sent out through the emails, and I'd rather give Todd the time than take it up by talking. So Todd, if you want to share your screen or however you want to handle this, it's all yours. And I'll give you a reminder at about just before 15 minutes in terms of wrapping up.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to be talking about getting around in a One Planet region, efficiency and equity. Here we go. And let's start with defining our ultimate goal. It's a modest goal. It's creating paradise on Earth. That's what we hope we can achieve. There are two visions of paradise. One is paradise is always a more distant place. So paradise is, let's say, a really nice house far from the city, or an isolated resort somewhere in the middle of nowhere. That vision of paradise requires a lot of mobility. You need wider roads so people who live at the urban fringe can drive to their stores and jobs in the city. And you need bigger airports so people can travel to farther destinations for those beautiful resorts. The other vision of paradise is what we create in our own communities. It's not another place, it is our place significantly improved. And this is important for transportation because these two different visions of paradise have two very different implications for how we plan our transportation system. If paradise is always a more distant place, then we need lots of mobility, and we need wider roads and more parking facilities and bigger airports and more travel and more energy. But if paradise is improving our own communities, then the priority is changing the way we travel, so we travel less and we rely more on the resource efficient modes. So let's see what that means. Here in Victoria, we have some targets that are, you could say they're the North Star. They're the guiding light to help us organize our transportation planning, because they set some targets for reducing travel, reducing emissions, transportation emissions, and increasing use of, in this context, I'll call it the affordable, healthy, resource efficient mode. So helping people drive less and rely more on walking and bicycling and public transit. Put briefly, Victoria has targets to more than double the amount of walking and bicycling that occurs. The CRD has targets to significantly reduce emissions and increase active transportation. British Columbia has similar targets, and so does Canada. So these are actually the functional ways that we can create paradise on Earth. If we can achieve these targets, we are creating more livable, efficient, affordable, healthy communities. So the way I think of it is we're valuing multimodalism. We're recognizing that there are many different types of travel, many different types of trips that people engage in, and we want a community where people can choose the most efficient option for each trip. So walking and bicycling and e-bicycling for local errands, high quality public transit when people are traveling on major corridors, automobile travel when it's truly the most efficient option. And there's a social equity issue here too. It's not just about protecting the environment. It's also about giving people their fair share. There are a lot of us, especially in who live in the more walkable urban neighborhoods, who either don't own a car, we're car free, or we own a car and we minimize its use. And so it's only fair that we should get our share of transportation investments in walking and bicycling and public transit. In fact, here in the CRD, about 20% of total trips are by walking and bicycling and public transit. And in Victoria, about 40% of trips are by those modes. And in downtown, more than half of all trips are by those modes. And we have targets to significantly increase those mode shares. So you could say that it's only efficient and fair to make comparable investments in walking and bicycling and public transit. There's another way to look at it. Walking, bicycling, and public transit are far more cost effective. They don't cost as much for users. They're far more affordable than automobile travel. And so it saves everybody money. It gives especially lower income people better economic opportunities and you could say more freedom if we ensure that anybody who wants to get around car free has that opportunity. So how do we do this? Well, the CRD has some pretty good plans to improve active transportation, but they're not funded anywhere near what they deserve. Just to put this into perspective, our current expenditures on sidewalks average about $16 per capita. No, $15 per capita. Our current expenditure on bike programs average about $35 per capita annual. Our expenditures on roads are about $70 per annual per capita, and our expenditures are $700. And our expenditures on parking facilities. So every time somebody builds a building, they're required by law to provide an abundant number of parking spaces, which are extremely expensive. And so there's a huge investment in off-street parking facilities. Follow the money. We are not investing anywhere near the amount on walking and bicycling and public transit as we do in automobile transportation. And that is, I would say, part of the root of our problem is that it's much easier to spend money on motorized transportation than on efficient transportation, or I should say on automobile transportation versus the efficient modes. So there's a lot we can do to improve active transportation. Our region has has a regional strategic transit plan. It's a great plan. The only problem is it's a 35-year plan, and I'm probably going to be dead by the time it's done, or at least some of us might be dead. There are good reasons to accelerate this public transit plan, so we complete it in, say, by the end of this decade, rather than having to wait till the 2030s and 2040s. There's an equally important perspective or approach, and that is thinking about how we design our cities. So in the past, people often talked about transit-oriented development, making sure that our communities are designed around high-quality public transit. Recently, planners have realized that actually there's an even greater potential for walking and bicycling to substitute for automobile travel, and that so we're now talking about a 15-minute neighborhood. That means most of what you need is available within a 15-minute walk or bike ride from your house or from where you work. There are some ways to measure this. Walk score shown in this map is a good illustration of the density of activities and your ability to walk to local activities. So we could, for example, set walk score targets that we're going to make sure that, say, 90% of people in our region have a walk score of at least, let's say, 70 or 75. There's some interesting research looking at what it costs households to live an automobile-dependent lifestyle. And one of the ways it shows up is that if you live in the core communities, the walkable, transit-friendly communities, on average, people are spending far less. Your household is spending about half as much on transportation as you would if you lived in an automobile-dependent sprawl. This, by the way, comes from the recent CRD Housing and Transportation Cost Estimate Study. So by creating better housing, especially more affordable housing in walkable urban neighborhoods, we're helping to significantly improve affordability and economic opportunity, health, and reducing climate emissions. How do you do this? Well, for the last 50 years, our zoning codes have been very, what we call exclusionary. In most neighborhoods, most residential neighborhoods, we forbid multifamily housing. There's a lot of attention now among planners for what we call the missing middle housing types, moderate density, relatively inexpensive to build housing types that could significantly increase the number of families, especially low-income families, that can live in walkable urban neighborhoods. So we say we support affordable infill. I don't have time to go into the details, but there's a lot of research among housing and transportation experts about how to do this and how to ensure that anybody, particularly families with low incomes, can find affordable housing in walkable urban neighborhoods. A real success story or a real model is the City of Vancouver's Climate Emergency Action Plan, which has a very detailed study guides for how the City of Vancouver can ensure that people who live there can rely on the resource efficient, affordable, inclusive modes. I have a personal interest in this since I was an advisor on this project. I'm very proud of it. And I want to end by pointing out this is not anti-car. Motorists have every reason to support a diverse transportation system where people can rely on walking and bicycling and public transit for many of their trips and only rely on driving when they actually need it. It reduces congestion, increases their safety, reduces motorist chauffeuring burdens. It's a win-win approach. So if anybody's interested in finding out more, you can visit the Cities for Everyone website. There's a lot of detailed information on why and how to create more inclusive communities, more affordable and inclusive communities, and more efficient transportation systems. Trevor, that's the end of my presentation. I think we're going to now go to the next speaker, and then we'll continue. We'll have questions and comments later, right?
Correct. And thank you for that. That was very impressive, and you did it well within your time. And of course, there was some very interesting connections back to the discussion we had last month, the whole notion of the missing middle and so on. And that's why this intersection between urban design and housing and transportation is so vital to everything we're talking about. So I'm going to turn, if you could release your screen there, I'm going to turn to Jasmindra. And Jasmindra, over to you.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Can hear you, and we can see the screen. It's all good.
Great. Thanks so much, Trevor. And thanks, Todd. That was an illuminating presentation. And I really liked your start off by saying paradise. Makes me think maybe we should have an exercise around paradise planning. So thanks everyone for being here tonight for Conversations for One Planet region. I'm going to be talking about accessibility, mobility, and equity. And before I start off, I want to say that I was born here on the unceded lands of the Saanich peoples. And my parents are originally from India, so I'm a proud daughter of immigrant parents. And Sat Sri Akal, which means hello in Punjabi. So thank you. And here we are, accessibility, mobility, and equity. For tonight's presentation, it's going to be a bit of a masala, which it means a mix. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Capital Regional District is doing or not doing, and give a few urban planning and mobility examples, as well as put forth some recommendations. And then I want to talk about a topic on public spaces and what I call racism in motion in our public spaces. So in terms of the CRD and municipal committees dedicated to accessibility and mobility, out of the 13 municipalities, we have a handful that actually have created committees. And these handful of municipalities are, we have the City of Victoria that has its own Accessibility Advisory Committee. It's an interim committee. At Esquimalt, we have the Access Awareness Committee. And then we have an intermunicipal advisory committee on disability issues, which consists of Colwood, Langford, the Highlands, Metchosin, and Souk. So you'll take note that municipalities such as Saanich, Oak Bay, View Royal, Central Saanich, and North Saanich, that these 5 municipalities right now are without a designated and specific committee addressing what I say instead of disability, as many are starting to say and have said for quite a few years, diversability issues, barriers and recommendations. So this is just a snapshot of our own region here in the CRD. In terms of accessibility, the City of Victoria defines this as it's used to describe the degree of ease that something, a device, service, or place can be used and enjoyed by people with diverse abilities. Accessibility requires conscious planning, design, and effort to ensure barriers are removed and the environment is highly usable and practical for the general population. The United Nations defines accessibility as, to quote, a precondition for an inclusive society for all, and may be defined as a provision of flexibility to accommodate each user's needs and preferences. So I am highlighting the City of Victoria because in 2015, they did create an accessibility working group, which has now transformed into the Intern Accessibility Advisory Committee. And together they created an accessibility framework at the City of Victoria. And out of this framework, it was identified that close to 19,000 Victoria citizens live with one or more diverse abilities. This means approximately 1 in 5 people over the age of 15 are impacted by the level of accessibility in Victoria, and an estimated 1 in 10 Victorians over the age of 15 have severe or very severe diverse abilities. So again, this information is coming from the accessibility framework at the City of Victoria. At the city, they're looking at accessibility as a part of equity. And really this means it's part of the city's broader equity and inclusion efforts that contribute to improve social health and well-being. And really the aim is to ensure that everyone has access to equal benefits and outcomes. And the city is also developing a community equity lens that will embed distributional, procedural, and structural intergenerational equity into their corporate policies and civic engagement. The accessibility framework touches upon three main areas: the built environment, governance and services, and capacity and collaboration. So for the built environment, you want to promote accessibility in the urban policy and design. For governance and services, you absolutely want to remove the barriers to and increasing participation in local government programs, services, information bylaws, and the public decision-making processes. And capacity and collaboration, we want to develop increased corporate capacity to develop professional services in a more accessible manner. And we want to build those new partnerships as well with accessibility service providers and advocate to other levels of government. It was interesting to note that out of the accessibility framework, the community members that came forth identified three main community themes. One is a need for greater awareness, education, sensitivity, and understanding on peoples with diverse abilities. So the participants emphasize that the city, service providers, developers, and businesses need to learn how people with diverse abilities travel through the community, how they interact in public and private places, and how they participate in events and activities. And in many cases, the very real barriers people with diverse abilities face mean they cannot fully participate in our community, which means there's an unfairness and equity is not at play. Number two, the importance of accessibility in the built environment within and beyond the geographic boundaries of Victoria. So there are many people with diverse abilities who come from other communities to work or play in the city. And participants identify the importance of retrofitting the built environment and applying new and coordinated regional standards to support accessible transportation. And finally, community members identified how Victoria as a city can use its role as a capital to demonstrate strong leadership and set the example and encourage a much higher community standard to improve acceptance and the quality of life for people with diverse abilities. In this framework, they also identified a series of types of diverse abilities, or as a city says, disabilities, but you'll hear me interface that word with diverse abilities. So some of these different types, one is identified as pain, which is referring to long-term or complex pain caused by injury, perhaps. Number two, flexibility, mobility, and dexterity. Number three is mental health. Number four are visual disabilities. Five is learning and memory. Another one is hearing. And the last one they've identified is developmental. And they've also categorized other as well. So these are the city's representations of the types of diverse abilities. And in this framework, I thought it was useful to have a visual, a map. So this is the estimated disability, diverse ability types in Victoria. So you'll note that out of 19,743 people, they had been identified with having a diverse ability in Victoria. And out of the total, there's a breakdown. You'll note that the diverse ability type of people that identify as pain related, there's about 12,000 people. And in terms of a diverse ability type of flexibility, there's about 8,000 people in Victoria. And in terms of mobility, diverse ability, there's about 8,000 as well. And then the next category is mental health related. So this is a breakdown from the accessibility framework of how they've identified disability types. The framework also identified, and this is crucial, we need to talk about the barriers in order to identify the recommendations and the solutions. So there are 5 barriers that were identified. The first one is attitudinal barriers. So behaviors, perceptions, and assumptions that discriminate against people with diverse abilities. And this is often formed from a lack of understanding, which can lead people to ignore, judge, or misunderstand those with disabilities. And there's more to that as well. There's also our unconscious bias and our implicit bias that comes into play. Number two, informational or communication barriers. This is when a person with a diverse ability cannot easily receive information that is available to others. A third barrier is technological barriers, and this is when technology does not meet the needs of people with diverse abilities. Number four is physical or architectural barriers, and this is when elements of buildings or the built design or outdoor spaces, when they create barriers. And finally, organizational or systemic barriers. And these are policies, procedures, or practices that may result in people with diverse abilities being mistreated or excluded or discriminated upon as well. So these are the barriers that were identified through the accessibility framework. And I thought that was really important as well to know what the barriers are to go forward and create this roadmap. So in terms of myself as an urban planner, I really feel that it's critical, and sometimes I feel we're not using this tool enough, but is to conduct community needs assessments. It's a critical planning process, and a community needs assessment is often the first stage of a project. And in this case, we want to involve and ask for community input on needs and solutions to mobility and transportation issues. So in a project breakdown, we often start with a community needs assessment, identifying the needs of the community. And then we want to go into a community engagement phase, and then finally a community mobilization phase. So briefly, many years ago, I was invited by my sister, who's also an urban planner, and she was in South Africa, and she was working there for about 7 years as an urban planner. And she invited me for 2 months as a consultant to go down, and I was doing data and research analysis. And it was interesting because Bombardier, as we know, is a company, and they wanted to create a SkyTrain corridor in the middle of Johannesburg. So they were working with the Ministry of Housing and the Ministry of Transportation. And I was doing a review of the local communities around this corridor. So Bombardier with the city of Johannesburg, they did a community needs assessment. So I was able to look at issues such as HIV and AIDS, single-headed family households by South African women, and looking at youth. So we were doing a needs assessment around this prospective planning project around a transportation corridor. So it's so important that we do that absolutely here within the CRD, that we do more needs assessments. Another critical area for urban planning is doing design charrettes, hands-on workshops that bring people from different disciplines and backgrounds together with community members to engage and explore together design options for a particular area or a particular issue. When I was an urban planner and a land use planner on Bowen Island for the municipality, I was involved with an architect on creating a design charrette on effective transportation, because on Bowen Island there is that main road, as many of you know, that gets off the ferry terminal. And we were posing 4 different design charrettes of different viable options, 4 different viable transportation options for Bowen Island residents through a design charrette. So another powerful urban planning platform. And finally, creative placemaking is another urban planning paradigm, and we're not utilizing it enough, but it's a process in which partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors, where they come together and they shape the physical, social, and cultural characters of the neighborhoods, towns, and cities around arts and culture. And Transportation America defines creative placemaking as harnessing the power of arts and culture to allow for more genuine public engagement, particularly in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color and among immigrant populations. So it also says, forget the traditional public meeting format, and let's reimagine artists engaging community members using multiple languages to generate meaningful dialogues, capturing their creativity and local knowledge to better inform us all. So this is creative placemaking. And for myself, from an urban planning perspective, there are some recommendations that we can put forth and create an inclusive roadmap and fabric. And I feel one is absolutely, let's advocate for the accessibility of it. Sorry, let's advocate for accessibility advisory committees, these specific design committees throughout all of our CRD municipalities. So right now we know we have some municipalities that have specific committees, but not all. So this is really important within our region. Number 2, I really feel it's important to conduct accessibility and mobility audits and checklists. And sometimes we're not using these measures as well within local government nor in community. So really important to conduct audits. And again, community needs assessments need to be embarked on. Number 3, if we can increase the handy dart services to same-day booking service, that would be wonderful. And the reason I say that is when I was working at the Students for the Society for Students with Disabilities at UVic quite a few years ago, I met a very powerful woman there who is visually and orally impaired. Her name's Elizabeth, and she spoke to me of her lived experiences and her stories in Victoria. And it's really saddening and disheartening to hear that there's no same-day booking service for people with diverse abilities in Victoria. So for example, they wake up, they want to go somewhere, they can't phone Handy Dart that day because Handy Dart, you have to pre-plan it. Whereas I know that I can get on a public transit mode and get down to Dallas Road or Crook Street Village, just like that. And there's a schedule of daily bus rides. But for people with diverse abilities, a very different view on life. And so I think we should encourage more conversations with people with lived experiences on the barriers of the Handy Dart system as well, and how we can improve upon it. And the last recommendation, it's so critical to provide education and training on bystander intervention, on racism and hate crimes in our public spaces. And the reason I say this is a nice segue going into the title of Public Spaces and Racism in Motion, because it's in our public spaces where many of us experience racism and discrimination, physically, verbally, in many shapes, ways, and forms. And our public transportation, for myself, I see it as a cultural planner, it's really racism in motion, because many racist crimes and incidents occur in our public spaces, such as on our streets, in our buses, and on our SkyTrains. These are public spaces. And this is where we see racism in motion, especially today. And in Vancouver, as many of you know, the anti-Asian hate crime statistics went up over 700% last year. And many of these anti-Asian hate crimes and incidences took place in public spaces throughout the city. And some of them were on SkyTrain platforms, in SkyTrains, and on buses and in our streets. So absolutely, we need to build safe spaces of mobility, especially those from equity-seeking groups such as IPOC, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and the LGBTQ2S+ communities, to make our cities inclusive, safe, and welcoming for all. And so I just wanted to share with you, as I said earlier, a bit of a masala of what the CRD is lacking in terms of not all our municipalities are on this roadmap. And the City of Victoria is doing really good work right now with their framework and their committee. And then moving forward, how can we as urban planners and community members come forth through design charrettes and creative placemaking processes and other formats to start designing our communities around mobility and accessibility and transportation? And then how do we build allyship and address racism that is real, it's raw, it's ravaging? You know, I'd like to take a moment to also honor the lives that were lost, the young children whose lives, as we know, were taken away in the residential school system. And so racism in motion, I'm planting that seed for all of us to think about that. How do we be effective bystanders in all of this? And I myself have experienced racism on the bus. I was told that my skin color, that I had burnt skin. I was told to get off the bus in Vancouver. Someone said, "Sick people," SIKH, "go home." And I was yelled at on the bus to get off in the middle of downtown Vancouver. These situations are real, and it's about community, local government, academia, the private sector, for all of us come together and let's talk about accessibility, mobility, and equity. Sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but absolutely necessary conversations. So thank you so much for holding space. Shukriya, as we say. And I'm going to now pass it over to Trevor. So thank you so much again.
Shukriya to you too, and to both of you. So you've heard now from both of our speakers, and we are open for comments, questions, discussion for about another 10 minutes or so. And then we'll take a break just before 6 o'clock while Claire sorts us into small groups. If you want to ask a question, we're a fairly small number. One option is to wave at me or wave at us. Another option is to use the hand up button if you can find it. It's under reactions. A third option is to just put an asterisk in the chat box. So has anyone got any thoughts, comments, or questions? Just while we're waiting, I'll start it off. So one of the things that interests me, and I've touched on in my columns, in fact, is in many ways, the best trip is the one you don't take at all from an environmental point of view. Maybe not so much from a social point of view. So ideas such as telecommuting, which we've seen blossom recently, but more broadly, the extent to which these days we shop online, we get access to all sorts of things online. It's not mobility, but it certainly is access. And it also generates a lot of inequity if you don't have the right technology, if you don't have the computer, the internet connection, all the rest of it, or the language becomes a barrier too. So I'd be interested in the comments from either of you about that aspect of what I would call getting around, if not actually physically moving, and where it fits into the picture. Todd, why don't you start?
Sure. So we are in the middle of a paradigm shift, a change in the way we define transportation problems and evaluate solutions. So in the past, we assumed transportation meant movement. And now we recognize that the ultimate goal of most transportation activity is access to services and activities. So Trevor, you're certainly right. There are many situations like right now in this webinar or this event where we're communicating without physical travel. And similarly, delivery services can substitute for physical travel. So you can shop online. Personally, I find it much less satisfying than sitting down face to face. So there is a sacrifice. And as you mentioned, there's a certain degree of inequity. For example, some jobs don't lend themselves to telework, to telecommunication. And a lot of people, they don't, especially lower income people, they don't have a home office. They don't have high-speed internet. So if, let's say you work in a big office, normally you're at the office, but during a pandemic, they say, oh, just work at home. The executives have a big house, private office, all the equipment, no problem. Their secretaries may be struggling, living several people in a cramped apartment, and it's an uncomfortable situation. So there are a number of, as discussed in my book, The New Mobilities, these new technologies have advantages and benefits, but also risks and problems. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that. One interesting detail that's really come out during the pandemic is contagion, or you could say COVID infection rates were, that as people stayed home, the infection rates went down. And if they live in a walkable urban neighborhood, so most of their interactions, most of their errands were a local trip in their neighborhood, their infection rates were very low. And people who lived in automobile dependent areas actually had higher infection rates. So whether you're talking about affordability or health or reducing contagion risks or economic opportunity, there are lots of good reasons to use the walkable urban neighborhood as your basic unit of planning. And then things like things like telework can complement that, but we shouldn't assume that suddenly that there's no need to plan for cities, that there's no need to develop urban neighborhoods because now everybody's going to live out in the rural areas, teleworking everywhere. That actually turns out to be a bad solution. So telework is useful if it's optional, but it's a bad solution if it becomes mandatory.
Jasminder.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective as well, Trevor, and what you're talking about. I see it as a balanced approach. If people are going to be working from home, we often talk about the work-life balance. And so, yes, you'll be using your computer and your Zoom, getting mobile and getting around in that way. But we know now the importance of nature-based planning, looking at our green spaces, looking at our public spaces, looking at our beaches. Because now we've been consumed with the pandemic, we're actually gravitating towards those spaces. So at the same time, we have to start looking at designing our neighborhoods and our parks and ensuring that we have these spaces going forward. So it's a balanced approach, that the way I would look at it. And I often feel that when Todd was talking about neighborhood planning, myself as a planner, a gap or a barrier for some reason, it seems we don't focus enough on neighborhood planning. Of course, official community plans, local area plans, and etc. But neighborhood planning, New York, Brooklyn's a great example, neighborhood events, neighborhood design charrettes, really getting your neighborhood involved, knowing who your neighbors are. And so we have a long way to go. And that's something we can work on in the CRD is neighborhood planning. So I see it as creating spaces in our neighborhoods where community comes together, now 6 feet away, face to face, but also working from home. And so if we can offer peoples and communities these work-life balance approaches through participatory planning processes and design, I think it's going to be interesting going forward. And looking at the youth, again, what's youth focused in terms of going forward on accessibility, mobility, and transportation as well. So.
Thank you. I've got Barry Webster on my list. Just a quick point, Todd. I thought that was interesting about the walkable communities and the infection rates. So if you've got a chance to send that out, we'll send it out to people. So to the link to that. Barry.
Thanks, Trevor. I have a couple of questions came up. I wanted particularly to bring up something that came up or came to me as Todd was presenting his excellent presentation. And that is that he expressed the interest in the various kinds of transportation systems we have in the city on the basis of the self-interest of the motorist, of the pedestrian, of the cyclist, and so forth. And I wanted to ask him why he did that, because in fact, many people have written on the fact that, in fact, the drive to be cooperative is far more prevalent in human nature than the drive to be selfish and individually oriented. And I would like him to, certainly on the basis also of what Jasminder said about neighborhood planning, I'd like to ask him why he hasn't thought about that in terms of his presentation and explaining why things are important.
I'm afraid I don't quite understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Yes. You based your presentation on the various alternatives in terms of money being spent in the city for transportation on self-interest. The self-interest of the cyclist, the self-interest of the motorist, the self-interest of the person looking for a parking space, the self-interest of the person wanting to ride the bus. In fact, why didn't you mention the fact that people, as they are looking for a community, that they have a drive to cooperate and make the community work, rather than just doing a bunch of individuals scrambling to make their own way?
Right. I approach it a little differently. What my research indicates, there are some really good surveys that have been done recently asking people what kind of neighborhood they want to live in. Until about 10 years ago, most people said, oh, I want to live in a single family house at the urban fringe. But during the last decade, the portion of people who say they place a higher priority of living in a walkable urban neighborhood where common services are available within a convenient walking distance has increased. So now the majority of households, the surveys indicate most people do want to live in a walkable urban neighborhood. Now, what my research indicates is that the policymakers and planners haven't got the memo yet. So if you look at how transportation dollars are allocated, and if you look at our zoning codes and development policies, they continue to assume that everybody wants to live an automobile dependent lifestyle in a single family house. And believe it or not, in most neighborhoods, in about 75% of Victoria's land base, only single family, low density single family housing is allowed. And if you want to build a more compact, walkable neighborhood, you have to go against the zoning codes. Or another example that that we can use is that the province right now is spending over the course of about 8 years, the province is spending $120 million to improve Highway 14 between Victoria and Saanich. Mm-hmm. There are about 3,000 commuters between Victoria and Saanich, automobile commuters. So they're spending $120 million to make it easier for about 3,000 people to commute. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, and that was not controversial at all. That was very easy for the Ministry of Transportation to do because there's virtually no oversight to their funding allocation. On the other hand, the city of Victoria is spending $32 million, so about a quarter of that, to improve bicycling conditions, to build our bikeways. And there are currently about 7,000 daily bicycle commuters in Victoria, and we have a target to double that. And yet that investment is highly controversial and required special funding. It requires a community decision to invest $32 million. So those are the kind of biases in the planning process that I work on professionally. And so I agree with you entirely. I think most people, if given the option, would choose more, depending on the context, you could call it the more affordable, healthy, resource efficient, sociable forms of transportation. They would drive less and rely more on walking, bicycling, and public transit if we took the money that we're currently spending to expand highways and made it really convenient and attractive to use active transportation and ride the bus. Let me ask you this. What would your vision of a perfect bus transit system look like? Would it be much more attractive? Would more people use public transit if, for example, it was almost never crowded, if the bus stops were actually nice places, maybe an arrangement with a coffee shop, so you're waiting for the bus, you're sipping your cappuccino, and then you wait for the bus to pull up right in front of the coffee shop. If the buses had onboard Wi-Fi service and you had really good integration, so you'd have, for example, bike rental services at most bus stations. Would that increase bus ridership?
May I respond?
And would that improve people's lives, especially low-income people?
Yeah, go ahead, Barry, and then I'm going to jump to Julian.
The problem is almost all of those variables you're talking about are self-centered. And one of the things I found when I used to commute to university as a prof was that I could spend the time on the bus talking to the other people who rode on the bus, and it was a sense of community that I got out of that. And it happened for me every day. And something that's not being mentioned at all is, in fact, the community promoting aspect of riding the bus. It's all oriented towards the things that an individual might want. It's all consumer society stuff. And I would say that if you're going to spend the time on letting us know how important it is to make sure we don't spend money on the Mackenzie interchange and Highway 14, which I totally agree with you on. The thing that we need to emphasize is the benefits people have of getting to know each other in the group activities of getting places. And I can tell you that it was a very positive influence on those of us who did that riding of the bus to work, whether we were students or profs or support staff or other people. We got to know each other in the community. And that's just one example of how that community cooperative orientation could be emphasized. And I don't see any of it in the planning the planning talk that's going on.
That's that point, Barry, takes me to one of my favorite quotes on this, and then I'm going to go to Julian, and then we'll take a break. The mayor of Toronto, John Sewell, I was at a presentation many, many years ago, and he described the TTC as the great democratizer, which is a really interesting way to think about public transit. Not only that it was, as you said, a place where community met, but as he put it, you have the whole community there because it was well used, because it was effective. And so young and old, rich and poor, black and white, male and female, literally had to rub shoulders with each other and learn to get on. And he saw that as a really vital democratic function, which is a really interesting way to think about transit. It takes it a step further even than you were talking about, I think. But yeah, I completely agree with you. And I don't think Todd would disagree at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Julian, you've been very patient.
Thanks, Trevor. And I'd be interested to hear from Todd and Jasmindra. And essentially, my question is, at the local level, like, where do we start with this? Like, where sort of what's the low-hanging fruit? And I think when we talk about public services like this, there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Like transit, for instance, if ridership's low, there's an incentive to cut service, and when you cut service, then less people want to use it, and you have this kind of spiral down. Ridership helps as that grows. The service can grow, becomes more frequent, and so forth. Similar, like Modo car share, it's like it gets stronger and stronger as the network grows, but that takes time. Again, like you have to actually build that network. And even when we talk about car-free households, a lot of people just aren't familiar with this. They grew up always with a car. There's always a big part of their life. And they just don't believe that people can live without a car, or at least long-term. So they tend to block housing proposals that propose not having parking spots. So I'd be interested to hear, where do we start in trying to accelerate this mode shift, get people out of cars and into these more sustainable, equitable modes of transportation?
Who would like to start? Jasmindra, start with you.
Sure, and then I'd be interested in hearing Todd myself, because Todd is an expert and a specialist in transportation. You touch upon so many issues, Julian, and nice to see you in this platform. I think for myself as a planner from that perspective, and as a community member, if we don't have these advisory committees, if we're not part of these advisory committees to ask those questions that you're asking. I sit on the Healthy Saanich Advisory Committee for the municipality of Saanich once a month, and so does Claire. And it's a great forum. So exactly, if you yourself, Julian, were part of an advisory committee, what you're saying right now could be put forth into a recommendation, which then would go to the mayor and council, which could be passed into a resolution, which links it back for me to do a community needs assessment. So again, when we have planning projects, whether it's development planning projects, whether it's transportation, whether it's a sewage treatment facility, are we doing a thorough community needs assessment? And that is a question I myself have too, because to answer your questions, you need to really utilize the expertise from the lived experiences of the users of our transportation and mobility areas. So I think I'm going to go back to advisory committees, absolutely. Getting neighborhoods together without local government is important. So we have community associations. Are we doing enough due diligence within our neighborhoods and community organizations to talk about transportation planning, to talk about equity and accessibility? I really feel, and that's missing, if you go in the southern hemisphere of the world, in many cultures and countries, they still practice the village elder system. So in India, they call it the panchayat. Panch means 5, means elders, ayat. It's the 5 elders sitting in the village where community members come together and say, hey, why don't we have a road connecting us with the agricultural sector? But these are examples of neighborhood planning that are transplanted from the global south. We're not doing enough of that here in North America, especially here. So again, let's bring in our community associations and let's start asking those questions. The answers really lie, I think, in us coming together, putting it effectively to local government, and then pressuring in good ways and advocating consistently. We have to talk about electric vehicles as well, because we know people are using their cars. Well, if they're using them, what about electric vehicles? What about outlets in our facilities to encourage those already with cars be more efficient for climate change? A lot of good topics. Julian, thanks. And I probably took a little bit more time, but I'm going to leave it over to Todd, who's more of the expert in transportation. Thanks.
Todd, over to you.
Sure. Well, if I understand the question correctly, what we want to do is plan a transportation system that favors let's say, for affordability and health and environmental protection's sake, we want to favor the forms of transportation that are resource efficient and affordable and healthy. We want to favor walking and bicycling and public transit. We've spent the last century planning for automobile transportation, so it is a challenge. Our transportation agencies and policies really focus on the faster, more expensive modes of transportation and just don't plan. So in my work, I would say there are a number of policy reforms that we need, and a lot of them are not officially transportation. They're about how we design our communities, how we can make sure a good, let's call it an indicator species, are children walking to school. When I was young, way back when, 80 or 90% of children walked to school. Now it's down to, in most communities, less than half of children walk to school. What happened over the last 50 years? Do children now have fewer feet? Is there a shortage of feet? No. We've designed communities, neighborhoods, that assume most people are going to drive everywhere. And then we become surprised when parents have to spend an inordinate amount of time and money chauffeuring the kids around because they don't feel safe allowing children to walk to school or friends or parks. So to me, the most important thing is to re-envision our neighborhoods. And we do have some good neighborhoods here in the core communities, but they're exclusive. They make it very difficult to build the more affordable housing in those neighborhoods. So from my perspective, the starting point is to make sure that it's easy to build lots of lower priced housing so anybody who wants to live in a walkable urban neighborhood has that option, and to reform some of our planning and funding practices so we're willing to spend at least as much so that a child could walk to school as we would spend to allow their mother or parent to drive them to school. And there are numerous steps between where we are now and where we would recreate the walkable urban neighborhoods that I think most people love. Fortunately, Victoria actually has good, what planners say, we have good bones. The starting for the city of Victoria and the other core communities, the basic structure, the basic street structure, and the fact that most neighborhoods have parks and elementary schools, that's really good news. That means that we can build on that. There's some suburban neighborhoods that are going to need more structural reforms, but there are solutions there. For example, e-bikes and e-scooters greatly expand the area where people can reasonably travel without a car. So those are the kind of things, if we are smart, we will build on that. It's not that we need to force people to give up cars. There are an awful lot of people, I think, who would prefer to drive less and rely more on walking and biking and e-bikes and public transit if it was really good service. It's up to us to plan that service.
Okay, thank you. You're getting a thumbs up from Julian, I noticed. And of course, many of you will remember that Julian was our speaker, one of our speakers last month, and is trying to build exactly the kind of housing that Todd is talking about and facing many of those frustrations. So we did run a little over our usual time, but I think that's fine. We're a smaller group this time. We'll probably, my guess will be only have a couple of breakout groups. I'll leave that to Claire, but we will take a short break. If you aren't going to stay around and you have not told Claire yet, please do, because it makes it easier for her to plan the breakout groups, of course. And we'll reconvene in what, about 5 minutes, Claire?
Sounds good. So that's 6:15.
Before you disappear, Todd, thank you, and thank Jasmindra for the presentations, much appreciated, and for also the good discussion afterwards. And thank you all for being here. And we'll see you in small groups in about 5 minutes' time.
So 6:15.
Okay, 6:15.